What is the most interesting historical case of a person who both made essential positive contributions to humanity, and committed unforgivable transgressions? Genghis Khan committed untold crimes against humanity, but his empire revitalized the Silk Road and allowed intracontinental travel in Eurasia to flourish, which gave Europe a taste of long-distance trade and planted the seeds of the West's global empires that eventually dominated the world. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Also, there is strong evidence he fathered 6 children with his slave mistress, Sally Hemings. Hemings' children lived in Jefferson's house as slaves and were trained as artisans. Jefferson freed all of Hemings' surviving children, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, as they came of age. They were the only slave family freed by Jefferson. Pretty sure Hemings was only like 14 when he brought her to France as his personal assistant too. Werner von Braun. His management of V2 factories that used slave labor killed thousands and he knew about it. But he was the father of the American space program, so we covered it up. It was part of a series of repatriation of German scientists to the US known as Operation Paperclip. Stalin. Probably in the top 5 most efficient leaders for national production, and even consumer benefits. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, almost no one in Russia had electricity, their military was incredibly outdated, the nation produced no steel, and there was almost no permanent settlements past the Ural Mountains. By World War II, the Soviet Union was mostly powered with electricity, had the world's largest iron manufacturing plant east of the Urals too, had one of the largest air forces in the world, literacy skyrocketed, healthcare became a thing in the country, and plenty of other modern amenities that are basic requirements nowadays. But he was also a paranoid tyrant and became enemy number 1 to the West the moment Hitler died, so that doesn't get brought to light for 99% of people. His 5-year plans really modernized Russia at an unprecedented rate, but that will always be shadowed by his love for draconian punishment and the devastating famines. Terrible guy. Did some great work though. And the whole people killing their children to eat thing too, millions in gulags etc. It brought Russia forward but at huge human cost. Alexander Graham Bell. Everyone knows him for the telephone, but he had awful backwards ideas about deaf people. He wanted to eliminate them from society, didn't want deaf people to talk to each other or marry and reproduce. He was a strong advocate for the banning of sign language. He really bent the idea on what is best for deaf people, and his impacts are still seen in schools today. Mother Teresa. She was known for her work helping the poor and sickly, but she was also known to have dubious ties to shady people who bankrolled her efforts. She was also known to forcibly convert patients on their deathbeds under the guise of spiritual blessings. Fritz Haber is the most clear example. In the early 20th century there was a panic over food shortages across the world with a ballooning population. There simply wasn't enough farmable land and not enough ammonia to fertilize land. Haber invented a way to synthesize ammonia, exponentially increasing the carrying capacity of the human race. He also was the father of chemical warfare, and helped the Germans develop chemical weapons in World War I. His wife was so ashamed that he had brought that evil into the world that she committed suicide in his backyard. He left his 1-2-year-old son at home and went to work with his wife's corpse in the backyard. Haber was German and Jewish. In World War II, one of his chemical pesticides, Zyklon A, was modified to create Zyklon B, the gas used during the Holocaust. Haber died in 1934, but Zyklon B was almost certainly used against his family. Thomas Midgley invented both leaded gasoline and CFCs. He was able to make a lot of expensive technology extremely cheap and efficient, at only the cost of thousands of years of damage to the environment. It's easy to talk about CFCs in a negative light nowadays, but most people don't realize that before them, refrigerators used ammonia or methyl chloride, both of which are incredibly toxic. So CFCs weren't great, but they were still a lot better than what they replaced. Robert McNamara recommended dropping the atomic bomb and got the US into Vietnam. In between WW2 and Vietnam, he was CEO of Ford Motor Company, where he implemented the use of seat belts. Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Civil War-era doctor who aided John Wilkes Booth in his escape through the South. Before Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, he conspired with him during his initial plan to kidnap the president. After the assassination, he treated Booth's injuries from the attempt, housed him for a day, then warned them that the authorities were onto them so they could escape. After being arrested and sentenced to life in prison, he helped curb a yellow fever epidemic in the prison that he was incarcerated in. Fr. Bartholomew de las Casas, Spaniard who wrote of the awful treatment of the indigenous people of the New World, and suggested that they stop enslaving them and replace them with African slaves. He was so close. You could say this about plenty of people. George Washington has slaves, and slaughtered innocent people, along with his own men, for not wanting to fight the British. Winston Churchill allowed massive famines in India to go unchecked and kill millions. Gandhi literally slept with his children. And then there are usually bad people who did great things. Hitler fought for animal welfare and fought smoking all across Germany. Genghis Khan helped the Mongol people live great lives and helped set back climate change by a couple years. There are no all good people, and there are no all bad people. That's not how people or history work. To assert to the contrary is not only false, but absurd. Most of America's founding fathers were very progressive for the time. It's easy to look back at them and judge them now that we're all a couple of centuries and a bit removed from them. It's easy to forget that any progress we've made for equality and civil rights was an incremental thing, and some parts of the world are still very backwards by modern Western standards. I don't really want to say it, but Hitler's World War II scientists, they did everything from create rockets that would become the basis of the space programs, jump ahead 15 to 20 years in medicine between surgery, cold weather conditions, adaptive reaction measures, and the others who would be folded into what would become the Manhattan Project, the CIA, etc., and also committed crimes against humanity. Also, the people in charge of, involved with Unit 731. Again, they ended up creating several huge leaps that have been the basis of essential technological and medical contribution. But then again, massive crimes against humanity were committed. Unit 731. 731 produced, for lack of a better word, useless information. It never did much, and many have, to quote Wikipedia, regarded the data as crude and ineffective, with one expert even deeming it amateurish. Antonio Egas Moniz was a neurologist and Nobel laureate whose work consisted of attempts to find effective treatment for severe mental illnesses for which there was no treatment at the time, early 20th century. Despite his good intentions, he ended up developing a procedure we know today as the lobotomy. I know it's technically reframing the question, but instead of a person, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Roman Republic, Empire. Rome was an unrepentant, dastardly force of imperialism, conquering and pillaging any and every culture they came across. At the same time, they spread literacy and technology more than any other force in human history. I'm surprised I haven't spotted Fred Phelps yet, founder of the vile Westboro Baptist Church. Yet also apparently he was a brilliant civil rights attorney in the 1960s who would take on racial discrimination cases that no other lawyers would touch. Margaret Sanger helped develop birth control, giving women around the world more control over their bodies and helping progress family planning, and started the organization which would become Planned Parenthood, but was also very racist, anti-Semitic, and largely developed those products to decrease the number of non-white people in the world. She's quoted in a letter to the editor of the American Journal of Public Health in 1981 as saying birth control, to create a race of thoroughbreds and more children from the fit, less from the unfit. That is the chief aim of birth control. The guy whom invented dynamite, or the person who created Zyklon B for farming. Nobel created the Nobel Prize, a reward for significant contributions to the good of man, because someone accidentally wrote an incorrect obituary calling him scum for creating explosives that would change war forever, that he invented in an attempt to make mining safer and more efficient. Carl von Linné, that one Swedish guy who named plants and was a renowned scientist. He also established the measuring of human skulls and other attributes to determine race. To be fair to Linnaeus, he tried to classify humans by race, but acknowledged that aesthetics and culture were the main difference, and beyond being naturally Eurocentric, he didn't try to establish a hierarchy or anything. He actually pissed off a lot of people suggesting that humans are related to primates and that we're part of the animal kingdom at all. I think he coined Homo sapien actually. The polygenist, i.e., people who think Adam and Eve only could have produced certain races, not other inferior ones, shit didn't really creep up until the 1800s. The discovery of skeletal differences between races leads some to believe cultural and cognitive differences were physical, leading to phrenology and all kinds of other scientific racism that flourished around that time. Linnaeus' work is often cited by these people, but I think they misrepresented his work, so I feel the need to defend him when this comes up. There was a Nazi scientist who was being tried for war crimes when the US government recruited him. He ended up building the Apollo rockets and helped further our space program. Ooh, I just thought of one. The guys on the Manhattan Project. The ushering in of the atomic age and the threat of geothermonuclear war is one of the worst turns of the history of our species. But, because of the threat of mutually assured destruction, the major global powers have not had any traditional massive loss of life and resources war in nearly 75 years. Vietnam entered the chat. Pablo Escobar helped out the poor while selling drugs and killing a Colombian football player for getting the team eliminated from the World Cup, and he killed a lot of people. A little late to the party, but here goes anyway. Thomas Midgley is what comes to my mind. In the 30s, refrigerators used dangerous chemicals such as propane and ammonia, which caused several accidents when leaked. Thomas Midgley developed a replacement called Freon, which saved lives and advanced science further. 50 years after his death, the scientific community discovers that Freon had been tearing holes in our ozone layer, causing irreparable harm. He also had a major role in the adoption of leaded gasoline. Dude was a living monkey paw. Adolf Hitler. Great record on animal rights. Humans, however, not so much. Gandhi hated the blacks. He also slept naked with young girls and liked to give them enemas. I didn't think that sentence could get worse, but here we are. I read somewhere that Al Capone was responsible for milk expiration dates becoming a thing. Andrew Jackson was a big proprietor of individual rights but caused genocide levels of bad against Native Americans. Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte is an excellent example. When he took the power in France, he stabilized the country and created the Napoleonic Code, which is used a basis form of many modern code of laws. However, he was a narcissist who craved and seized power, declaring himself emperor. He was obsessed with war and caused a lot of unnecessary bloodshed. Walter Wenck was a German officer during World War II who had fought on several fronts and earned the Iron Cross from the German military. However, during the Battle of Berlin he was given an order to push into the city and hold back the millions of Soviet troops attacking the city. Many of his troops were either young boys or older men, all of whom were low on ammunition. He disobeyed orders and launched a breakthrough assault to relieve encircled groups of soldiers and civilians, then turned and broke out the way he'd come, protecting over 250,000 civilians and non-combatants from the Soviet onslaught all the way to the Elbe River, across which were the American lines. Wenck held a line of defense long enough for all the civilians and soldiers rescued to retreat across a broken bridge to the American lines and surrender to them, rather than the Soviets, with himself being one of the very last to cross the bridge, shortly before it was destroyed by Soviet artillery. William Shockley, the brilliant physicist who helped develop the transistor, turned out to be extremely racist, and was a huge advocate of all the IQ by race theories and forced sterilization, but he also was essential to the development of the transistor. So yeah. Adolf Hitler. He was responsible for WW2 and the Holocaust, but he also killed Hitler. Yeah, but he also murdered the guy who killed Hitler. Gaius Marius brought a lot of great reforms to the Roman Republic, but he also allowed proscription and in his last consulship slightly f***ed the country for a bit. Diane Fossey, IMO. She was a world-renowned environmentalist and researcher who spent years in the jungles of Rwanda studying gorillas. She's the author of Gorillas in the Mist, which most people have at least heard of. According to people who knew her, she was also a racist alcoholic who sometimes kidnapped and tortured people she suspected of poaching, including children. One story goes that she beat a suspected poacher's genitals with stinging nettles. Mindy Street. Claire, cocaine addict, corporate lawyer, but she developed plans for a global foundation that would help kids all over the world, advance human rights, revolutionize agriculture, and improve every nation and every society in every possible way. It's complicated. William Temple Hornaday was one of the first people in America to push for preserving wildlife by keeping it alive, instead of killing it to stuff and put in a museum. He may have been instrumental in saving the American bison from extinction. He also put a black man in his zoo. J. Marion Sims pioneered the surgical cure for vaginal fistulas, which gave thousands of women their lives and dignity back. Did it by performing experimental surgeries on black slaves without anesthesia. General Oliver Howard fought for the Union in the American Civil War, worked for the rights of freed slaves and was a champion of higher education for the freedmen. Howard University was founded by him, but also conducted campaigns against Native Americans in the Indian Wars.